Non-domestic rating, multipliers and private schools bill.
We are now sitting in public and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we begin, I'd like to remind members to please switch off electronic devices or to silent. Tea and coffee are not allowed during the sittings. Today we will first consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence for publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions before the oral evidence sessions. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without debate. I first call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in his name, which was discussed yesterday by the Programming Subcommittee.
That move.
The question is the programme motion as on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence. The question is the motion as on the amendment paper. As many of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence received by the committee will be made available in the committee room. I now call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private. As many as that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. We now go into private session to discuss lines of questioning. We now hear oral evidence from Gary Watson, Chief Executive Institute of Revenues, Rating and Valuation. Before calling the first member to ask a question, I remind members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill. We must stick to the timings in the programme motion that the committee has agreed. For this session, we have until 9:50. Right, so we go straight. Right, I call David Simmons.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning, Mr Watson. There's been a great deal of debate about the impact that the measures in the bill will have on high streets, which, as we know, contain a variety of different businesses. So I wonder perhaps if in opening your evidence you could share your view about what the overall impact is likely to be on our high streets of the measures in the bill.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. I think as a professional body, as I say, we've got members in both private and public sector, so we look at obviously the bigger picture when it comes to non-domestic rate, and obviously the high street is a key part of non-domestic rate, particularly obviously from a local government perspective. We welcome, I think it's fair to say, the sort of focus on the high street. And what I mean by that is that giving some degree of certainty, because I think one of the weaknesses that we've had over, well, essentially the Localism Act, is that we've had temporary supports very much from one year to another. What we've now got is an element of certainty. I think that has got to be welcomed. I think the concern as a professional body in terms of giving that support to the high street is the complexity now within the rating system. And what I mean by that is that Obviously, at the moment, we have 2 multipliers. We're obviously going up to 5 or 6 multipliers. I think that's very difficult for all people to understand. We have had the support, the temporary support for the high streets. I think it's fair to say the high street is changing. I look at my own high street, and every sort of weekend I go down there, there's different types of shops, and I think the high street is completely changing. But it's still a thriving high street, and I think it's changing in lots of different ways, and I think the way that the business rate system works needs to be flexible to meet the different challenges, and no one high street is the same. I think you've got to recognise that a high street in one area of the country is completely different to another area. Having said that, we have a national non-domestic rate system, and what we're doing is applying very often a national system to local issues, and any relief that you base on rateable values, perhaps. When we go back to 1990, there were no rateable value limits to reliefs. Obviously, we have rateable limits all the time, and that does mean that different areas of the country get treated in different ways. But I think it's fair to say that the high street still needs to be a focal part of any government measures to reform the business rate system.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may just follow up with a further question. So you mentioned the key role that local authorities play in the administration of this system. The bill will introduce provisions whereby the Treasury can make alterations around those multipliers. What, in your view, is the appropriate time period to ensure local authorities have sufficient run-in to ensure that any of those alterations that are made are able to be administered correctly? And do you have a view, given that the business rate take then feeds into a national pooling arrangement, about both the timescales and the necessary consultation to ensure that both at Treasury level and local authority level there's clear sight about what the impact any of those changes that are made at Treasury level will then have, both on the administration and on the sum of business rates that are then collected from it?
Well, I think there's different issues there that come out of that. One, obviously, business rate is a major source of financing local government, and local government need to plan ahead in terms of their own finances. In terms of making sure that the high street is aware of the changes, the longer notice that you give is better. I think local government always reacts very quickly. To be able to sort of give the high street, if we're going to focus on the high street, as much notice as possible, I would say normally you would work on, say, a year. You could pick different time periods, but I think of a year, because from the planning point of view, I think also from a local authority point of view, in terms of engaging with the local community, the longer you do a proper consultation, I mean, consultation goes on now, but more local consultation, and there'll be different high streets within different areas. You know, you'll have more than one high street to perhaps focus on. Bids has been a very good example where local authorities have worked with business improvement districts, and that's been in good engagement. But the longer time as possible, I think it's right to have the flexibility within them. Obviously, there are limits with the 2 lower and 1 on high more multipliers. I think that's right. You could argue that does create an element of uncertainty as to know what one multiplier is going to be from one year to the next. But when you compare it to what we have at the moment, where you really don't know what you're going to have from one year to the next, it really doesn't allow the local authority to prepare, but it doesn't allow the high street to prepare either.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watson, and thank you for taking the time to be here, but also the insight that has been provided to the first question. I'm interested in the point made about the number of multipliers, and in a sense, there is a risk, if I can take what you said correctly, that the more that you provide, the more confusion there might be in the system. But isn't the counter-argument, and certainly our position, is that the business rate system in itself is a blunt tool by design almost. And in creating this different approach, that we are better able to target both the support that we provide for retail, hospitality and leisure, but also where we create that pool of funding from in terms of those large footprint occupiers in warehousing and distribution. So it'd be interesting to get an insight into how you and your members would see that balance being struck in the right way.
Yeah, I think if, as a professional body, and obviously we have quite diverse views sometimes within a professional body, because you have those working in, say, local government, and then obviously you have those working in the private sector, and they can have some quite different views sometimes. If we stood back and looked at what would our preference have been before we saw the bill, the whole relief system is very complicated at the moment. They don't interact with each other. It's confusing for the ratepayer. It's confusing perhaps for the local authority. It's finding, you could look at the whole reliefs and sort of start again. What we've got are the multipliers, and that's what we've got to work with. I think if we had the choice at the beginning, we might have looked at perhaps a more targeted form of mandatory relief possibly. But we are where we are. So I think the important thing is that we will make it work. I think it does give the flexibility to government to change. I think what you found with the pandemic, for example, that the property tax system to some extent came to the fore because it allowed government very quickly to get money out the door, but to target it to certain types of business. I think the key issue will be that once, I'm assuming the bill gets royal assent, is the secondary legislation being very, very clear the types of business the government wants to support with the different multipliers, perhaps the exclusions that one's consider, but that allows it to be flexible as well. So it isn't as if, well, that's what you've all got to work from. As I say, by keeping it in secondary legislation, things will change. And the important thing is that what we found with the last sort of 10 years is that because it's all under Section 47, it allows government to bring things in really, really quickly without any legislation. There's no delay, and local government can get the money out the door and that support really quickly. But it also allows local government to plan in terms of the financial side as well.
And really just on that point, isn't that why this measure is so important? Because if we think about the types of shocks that many businesses face, the pandemic was exceptional, I guess, but it was so profound in terms of its shock that having that flexibility to be able to move quickly and adapt was actually very important to the system. Secondly, the current system, aside from it being temporary, short-lived and a cliff edge, business didn't know whether it was going to continue or not, if it was going to continue, in what guise. It also had the impact of capping at £110,000 the amount of relief that could be given to any business. I'd be interested in your view on how you and your members perceive the high street, because I know from an Oldham perspective, when I look at the high street, actually, Boots, Specsavers, national retailers are actually the foundation of many high streets alongside local independent retailers, where previously they were locked out of the temporary scheme. So it'd be interesting to get your views on that.
Yeah, I think in terms of the high street, the companies that you named are there. As I say, they are often a draw, but that's the benefit to the smaller ones. As I say, when we've lost some of the more well-known ones in the high street, those particular properties don't stay empty too long, certainly the smaller ones, because people move in very, very quickly. So I didn't actually get the second part of the question, so I didn't...
Well, the first part of the question was more about just how agile the system can be. So allowing secondary legislation as part of this is about that agility and being able to move to recognise any shocks in the system to make sure that if there is a hit to the local economy or to the high street in particular, the system can move quick enough to be able to save it at the right point was the point.
And that is one of the criticisms of the rating system, because outside of that particular Section 47, it wasn't flexible. It couldn't adapt very quickly. So by having that flexibility within the multipliers, both the higher multiplier but also the lower multiplier, but also allowing you how to direct the particular reliefs, then, as I say, I think that has to be a good thing, and that's good for the rating system, and it's good for those that pay the rates and also for local government.
Thank you.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to just touch on that a moment, because if you the bill will give the Treasury the power to apply those additional multipliers.
Sorry.
The bill will give the Treasury the power to apply those. But I'm wondering about what your feeling is around whether that should be a local decision, because you've hit the nail on the head. The way business rates works can be really impacted by a local situation of a retailer going out of business or very high rents. Do you think that this bill gives enough ability for local areas to think about how they might need to apply different multipliers? And would you like to see there they're more sort of regional or local implications rather than it all through the Treasury?
I go back a long time in business rates, and I was working in rating up until 1990 when it was very much the local authority. The local authority set the rate, they collected the rate, and that was one of the reasons why they obviously went to a national non-domestic rate in 1990. I think the councils have a key role to play. That's why I'm very keen that the relief system that you have gives local authorities an element of discretion, that they can direct reliefs to certain types of rate pay, and that isn't just into the high street, that's the wider picture. I think to ensure an element of consistency, I think that it is interesting when the reliefs were coming in during the pandemic. There were a lot of local authorities that turned around saying, well, can't you just tell us what it is? And then the central government was saying, well, but you wanted the discretions, now you want it sort of control. You can't have it every way. So I think it's a balance. I think that you do need, it raises so much money. It's all the strengths of a property tax is there for both central government, local government, but also for the ratepayer as well. So I think it's getting that balance. I think the central rate, controlling that is right, but I think making sure that councils have an element of discretion, whether that be through a variance in the multiplier, whether it be through a particular relief, that is to say something to be considered. But again, you've got to be careful because local government is different in lots of different areas. There's different challenges in lots of local authorities, and you're trying to sometimes have a rating system that fits every part of the country, and that's why you do need that flexibility there.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr Watson. What impact do you see that the changes to the multipliers might have on the number of appeals that are coming through the business rate system? And do you think those appeals are more likely, less likely than at the moment to sort of have a grounding, have a basis, or is it going to all but clog up the system? What's your position on that?
I don't see particularly. It's an interesting question on the appeals, and if I just perhaps pick up on a point on appeals, the one thing we are going to find, if we focus on the retail and hospitality, at the moment, if someone doesn't receive one of those reliefs from a local authority, the only way they can challenge it is by way of judicial review. And that's a very high barrier to sort of meet. And what we're finding is that some councils will interpret it and give it, some councils will interpret it and won't give it. What you're going to find once this bill goes through is those challenges will move from judicial review into the magistrates' court. So if a council chooses not to give a relief, the challenge would be against a liability order application. Now, I think what you'll find is that you will get more cases being challenged at the liability order hearing, because however you draft a set of an SI that says these people will definitely get it, these people won't, these people subject to whatever, those challenges are going to move into a magistrate's court. And is that, you could argue, is that the right place to have those challenges? The Institute's view for a long time has been that having all disputes on business rate, whether it be liability, occupation, mandatory, these reliefs, probably the magistrates' court is probably not the best place for them. The best place for those is probably in the valuation tribunal, where the valuation disputes of business rate goes. All the council tax disputes go to the tribunal, but business rate doesn't. So I don't necessarily see lots of, the revaluation will obviously be the trigger, or when how many appeals come in, and I think when you look at, my valuers have given me some sort of heads up in terms of, the areas that might see the big increases at the next reval. But when you're looking at appeals and you focus on perhaps the retail, hospitality and leisure, those challenges will come into the magistrates' court. And I think the weakness of that also is that the only way you can challenge it is to refuse to pay the rate, to get summons, to go into court and argue to magistrate. Now, case law is good because it does build the rating system, but I just feel that that might be something to keep an eye on perhaps going forward. So I think there will be a lot more appeals against the billing authority's decision, whereas at the moment they don't challenge through judicial review because it's a very, very high barrier to change. And a ratepayer could turn around and say, well, that council's giving it to me, but that council's not. Can you really go to judicial review? And I think the challenge would probably be unsensible. And we haven't seen any, certainly my understanding, since since those discretions have come in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us this morning, Mr Watson. I represent two towns, Ilkeston and Long Eaton in the East Midlands, and both of the high streets in our towns have suffered for a long period of time. We have quite a large number of small retailers, many have closed over a long period of time. But there's been a lot of work locally, particularly done by one member of the community in regeneration of one of the towns in particular, basically clubbing together a lot of small independent retailers and working together to bring the community back up itself. Could you comment on how this bill is going to tangibly affect the community itself and those small retailers?
I'd like to think, because obviously you've got the bill, and all the time you have got the small business rate relief. So, you have got the small business rate relief that sits there. Yeah. Obviously, the issues you have with that is it's again limited on rateable values, and rateable values, obviously, in one part of the country are going to be higher or lower for the same type of property in another. I think the area that might want to be looked at is that when the next revaluation takes place, you look at the ceilings that you have on those rateable values, because at the moment, for the small business rate multiplier, you go up to 51,000. You obviously have the small business multiplier. So if you're trying to target it, it may well be that once we know what the outcome of the the rateable values are going to be at the next reval, it may well be that the support that you could give would be through, as I say, uplifting the values. In terms of the bill itself, obviously you've got the flexibility of obviously the two lower multipliers. I think it's right, going back to an earlier question, to have that flexibility so you could vary it depending on the circumstances. So it does give that flexibility, but I think also you do need to think about the small business rate relief, and that's there anyway, and that might be something to look at in terms of targeting when it comes to the next reval itself. And that wouldn't need, I think, sort of more secondary legislation rather than primary legislation as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your evidence. It's been very interesting. My constituency, East Thanet, is taken up. Is made up of three towns: Ramsgate, Broadstairs, and Margate. All three of them seaside towns, very, very dependent on all of these sectors that we're talking about: tourism, hospitality, leisure, and so forth. You've been talking about the fact that there's going to be a centrally decided approach when it comes to those sectors. What value do you think there might be in an approach which recognises those kind of geographical challenges of particular areas? So you don't just have a complete free-for-all in terms of local government picking and choosing how they might do it, but that you might say, yes, we do need to have a particular approach when it comes to geographical challenges that some commercial centres and the high streets have.
Yeah. I think you could look at the bill giving a framework. And the framework is that at the moment, obviously, you have the standard and the small business multiplier. You've got the flexibility with the two lower ones, one or more, depending on how you want to move those forward. From a local authority point of view, if you've got that national sort of situation, you then got to look at each of those individual areas, and no one area, as I say, is the same, and they're not always going to be the same. Things will change. That's where the local authority comes into play, and that's where you need to have the relief systems in place. Now, the one thing that you have got within the legislation anyway is that, and I'm sorry to bore you with legislation, but Section 47 allows the local authority to give relief to any ratepayer that they want to. The only thing they've got to do is take into account due regard to your taxpayers' interests. Well, obviously they are, because the taxpayers are benefiting from having a thriving high street. So in a way, that relief system is already there. So I think creating the framework is fine. As I say, yes, there's that concern about the complexities of the whole system itself, but then you're trying to then direct it to make it more agile, as the term's been used. So I think that there's no reason why the framework can be put together through the bill, but then the relief system could actually be using, say, the three towns that you've referred to. And I think there's other, I'm familiar a little bit with those three towns because one of my council members actually is from Thanet, so I know that quite well. But as I say, I think the relief system is there. The issue you'll have, though, is that when it comes to funding those reliefs, local authorities will have that issue of have they got all the funding, and that's where I always say that you can't look at the property tax and local government financing separate. When you talk of reforming council tax or business rate, local government finance, the two have to always be considered together.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. I thank our witness on behalf of the committee for the evidence. We will now hear oral evidence from Paul Gerrard, Campaigns, Public Affairs and Board Secretariat Director at the Co-op. For this session we have until 10:20. Welcome, Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome. We're all familiar with your business as a mainstay of many of our high streets. Would you be willing to give us your assessment of the overall impact of the bill, both on the stores that you represent, but also your view about what it will do to the retail environment in which they sit?
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee. So the Co-op Group's got about 2,500 stores right across the country. Predominantly they are small stores, they are convenience stores in high streets, local precincts. Our rates bill is significant. It's the third biggest operational cost we have after people and rent. And in 2024 we expect it to be just north of £100 million. Our stores are overwhelmingly in small stores in communities. And I think the point about those kind of stores in the high streets that they're in is that they are very much
Mr. Gerrard, can you speak up a bit? The broadcasters are having trouble picking you up.
It's not something I often get told, but I will try and speak a little bit louder. Our stores are overwhelmingly in the heart of communities on high streets in precincts, and I think they are anchor institutions for many of the communities. I think we saw during the pandemic in Technicolor how those local stores are genuinely the heart of communities. I think it's still true now, it's just like it's perhaps a bit quieter and over a longer period. Certainly communities that certainly for us, you can tell when you look at communities that are facing tough times and challenging times, you'll see boarded up shops. And I think in a sense that's the flip of a vibrant high street. There's obviously bits of this bill that we don't yet know. We don't know, as your previous witness said, the revalorisation exercise, what that will do, and we don't know the precise levels of the multipliers. But as far as we're concerned, this will have a positive effect on about 92% of our estate, a significant impact. It will also, as far as I can see from the data I've seen, positively impact about 98% of all retail stores. This bill will mean, I would expect that some of our stores, some of our properties, depots, headquarters will pay more, but we think the value that shops bring in high streets, not just commercially but socially, is important, and therefore we should rebalance, and we've called for that for a long time. So we very, very much welcome this bill. Obviously the detail to be confirmed, but the policy principle behind it to support small stores in communities is absolutely right.
Positive impact on the vast majority of your stores. Could you just walk us through how you've reached that calculation, and particularly with reference to, you said, the different types of environments in which those stores are located and the different footprints that they'll have?
Certainly. So we've got about 2,750 properties, of which about 220 are not classed as retail, hospitality or leisure. So there'll be depots, there'll be our funeral business, care homes, there'll be headquarters, etc. But we've got about 2,500 stores. Of those, about 62% have got a rateable value of less than £51,000, and about just over a third have got a rateable value of between 51 and 500. So they will go into the what we are assuming will be the two lower multipliers. Now we don't know what the levels will be below the standard multiplier, but assuming sort of levels which I think the industry is working as assumptions of sort of 10 and 20p, that will have a significant impact. What I would say is that the stores, the properties that we have outside of that are either non-retail, hospitality and leisure or bigger than 500, they do make up 20% of our rates bill. They won't benefit. In fact, we would expect the rates bill for the bigger properties to go up. So this is a bit of balance, but for us overall, it will significantly support our stores. And also, in addition to our 2,500 stores, the Co-op also wholesales to another 5,000-6,000 independent stores. And from talking to colleagues in those businesses, again, this new structure of rates will significantly support those independent small stores as well.
Thank you, Chair. Can I refer to my register of interests, just for the record? Mr. Gerrard, many of the stores that you operate actually aren't on what you might consider the high street or town or city centres. In fact, they are often the last remaining store on the estate in a community. And it'd just be interesting to hear your views on how you think this might contribute to those being more viable. I think we found, particularly during the pandemic, when children were being educated from home and given vouchers to get meals during the day, that actually there were significant retail deserts in large parts of the country where that immediate meal wasn't available, bar for the local convenience store that was on the estate and in the local neighbourhood. So it'd be interesting to see from that perspective, beyond the high street and town centres, how you think these measures might impact.
You're absolutely right. Many of our stores are on high streets, but lots are in just local stores that will literally be the corner shops on streets. The rates bill is significant. As I said, it's one of the top three costs that we have alongside our people, and you know the COPE has always paid the Living Wage Foundation real living wage because we think it's the right thing to do, and that's for every colleague regardless of age or employment status. And the other one is rent. And then the third one is rates. Rates, I don't think we close stores because of rates. But what I do think is that rates make some stores really difficult to be viable, the current rate system. I think if you add on to that issues around crime, and I've given evidence in this place before on crime, there are a lot of costs that are hitting us. And I think the proposals here, particularly for those small stores, you know, I think it is about 2/3 of our stores are underneath 51k rateable value. This rates bill will make a significant impact on the viability and profitability of those stores. And you're right, during the pandemic, when we were all told to stay at home to keep safe, absolutely, my colleagues and colleagues in shop workers throughout small stores went in and made sure the shops were open so people could get food and water to live. And I think, as I said before, I think we saw in Technicolor how important small stores are. You know, the retail sector is multi-channel, it's got lots of different parts of it, and those different parts play different roles and have different impacts. Small stores are the beating heart of communities. We've done some work which we're just refreshing that says if you have vibrant high streets, what you have is better mental health. You have a whole range of better outcomes, and those small stores are at the heart of it.
And just leading on from this, one of the other measures in the proposals would be to remove the current cap on the temporary relief so that multiple operators, national operators like Co-op and others, will benefit more from this scheme. It'd be interesting to take your view, because you'll have, no doubt, a view on the tax system in the round and the impact that has overall on the business. Is it recognised that there is an attempt being made here to make sure that those national retailers are as important to the high street and communities as independents, and actually it's the ecosystem overall that makes a place thriving?
I think it's very welcome. We are a national business of little shops. You know, we have 2,500 little shops all around the country, and those little shops bring different economies of scale to, say, a big box that's in a huge retail park on the outskirts of town. So I think this is very much looking at the kind of shop rather than the kind of business, and I think that's important because independent. As I said, we wholesale to 5,000 independent stores, and we see it all the time. But it's about the nature of the shop and where it is and the impact it provides in communities, not just commercially but socially. We ran a few years ago a campaign with the British Red Cross on loneliness, and our colleagues would tell me that very often the most vulnerable people in society is the only people they spoke to was the people at the local shop, my colleagues in a co-op, or perhaps in a nicer or in a Sainsbury's local or whatever it may be. They are really important as a kind of shop, and that's, I think, what this bill recognises.
Thank you,
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gerrard. Can I just ask you a little bit about certainty? The bill gives the power to introduce these multipliers for that year. Obviously, you must plan a long time ahead with so many stores. Can you just give us a bit of a comment on whether you think having a bill that allows changes to be made so frequently is a problem for you, or whether it adds some benefit?
I mean, your underlying point that businesses like certainty is well made because we try and plan ahead. So, you know, if I think back 18 months when we had the energy crisis, that was unforeseen and caused a real problem. So you're absolutely right, certainty is important. I think also though the flexibility depending on the economic circumstances at the time. So the pandemic allowed a different flexibility. So I think there's a balance there. I think what is important is that in deciding that there is a real level of transparency and openness. I spent 20 years in government, much of it in the Treasury and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. I would say of my time there indeed that perhaps we weren't always that open and transparent with businesses. And I think the more open they are and the more officials can advise ministers based on what is happening into the business community, the better. So I'm relatively comfortable about the structure, but I just think it's the ways of working that are important.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Gerrard, for coming today to give evidence. I want to put on record my support for the premise of supporting community shops and stores and providing somewhere for people to go to do their shopping. But you mentioned that the provisions in this bill make distribution more expensive, and shouldn't we be concerned? Shouldn't you be more concerned that home delivery will be more expensive as a result of this bill, because we know home delivery is very important to vulnerable customers?
So the co-op runs, I think I'm right in saying we've got the biggest quick commerce business in the country. You know, people order through aggregators and will be delivered from our stores. So it's something that we have within our business model. I think there is clearly, to keep this revenue neutral, there will be costs going on to some of the depots and distribution centres, and I think that will bring extra costs for that. I think that's the price of the revenue neutral. I think in the round, the impact on small stores and local shops will outweigh the potential risk around home delivery. But as I said, we have a home delivery business. I think that our quick commerce business is the biggest in the country for small, quick delivery. So I think you're right to flag the risk, but I think in balance we would say it's a positive thing that we are supporting bricks and mortars as much as we can.
Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much, Mr. Gerrard, for your answers so far. They've been really insightful. In Leeds South West and Morley, my constituency, we have co-op shops, and we have a co-op shop in New Farnley, and it's virtually the only shop in that community, and it was an absolute lifeline throughout the pandemic, but it's still a lifeline even today when there aren't other shops. So we've had some questions about consistency, and obviously the aim of this legislation is to provide consistency for businesses, especially those in retail, hospitality and leisure, by providing lower multipliers. You've talked about how beneficial it will be for about 92% of your properties. Can you talk more broadly about the benefits this might offer to other retailers too?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a couple of points I'd make. I think the last time I looked, about 95% of retail is micro businesses, less than 10 employees. I think from the data I've seen, 98% of retail stores are in one of the have a rateable value below 500k. So this helps 92% of the co-op absolutely. But I think from what I saw, it helps 98% of the broader retail sector. I would also say that in my experience, in the co-op experience, is that particularly high streets or precincts aren't made by one business, but you can often get one business beginning to drive vibrancy in that place. So if one business can make it work, you attract custom. That custom might want to buy other things, so you'll get a ripple effect from that. So I think this will help communities because it will make those small stores, either small stores from independent traders or from national business like the co-op, it will make it much more viable to be in communities. So I think the ripple effect will be significant. And as I said before, there's a commercial thing there, but as you alluded to, there's a hugely important social and community perspective here as well.
Thank you so much.
Serena Breckenridge.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gerrard. I'm the Member of Parliament for cities and towns like Wolverhampton and Willenhall, and we've got a number of co-ops and similar stores. within that sector. I hear today about the welcome certainty that this brings, and also the majority of stores, co-op stores, will benefit under this new bill. Co-ops and similar stores are important local employers, and local employers for generations within the community. So I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts on the impact of that.
So I think, as I said before, I think local stores and the co-op as an example play a hugely important social role. They are also though economic entities, commercial entities, and we employ 55,000 people. And the vast majority of my colleagues are either in stores, as in your constituency, or in our funeral care homes, or in our legal services, so they're customer facing. I think what this does is means that it makes more viable our business model of small shops, absolutely, and that means that we can continue to employ people. And I think the point here is that it also means that we can continue to behave in line with our cooperative values principles. So as I said before, we've always paid the real living wage as rates are set by the Living Wage Foundation. We've always sought to have a different kind of product in store in terms of its ethical roots. All those things this will help us to continue to do that. We've done it for 180 years on the 21st of December this year. This will play a role in helping us, as will other measures that the government have taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming in today to give evidence. So you've said just then, and I think you said earlier around it's going to make smaller stores more viable and it's going to affect your bigger stores. Do you just want to give us a bit of a flavour about what that means for your business, and would that put you off doing bigger stores and concentrate on smaller stores? And then you've mentioned a lot around, you've done analysis around where it's beneficial to you. Have you done any wider analysis of where your stores are in the high street around what it means for the totality of the high street?
Can I just encourage all members in terms of the broader analysis, as I said, we supply about 7,000 in total, so including our own 2,500 stores, about 7,500 stores. And the conversation, and I'm not sure I would term it deep analysis yet, but our impression and our conversations say that this will support those kind of shops, which are not just our own, but shops in local communities. The data I've seen that's been shared across the sector says about 98% of stores are rateable value below £500,000. So if it's a 500,000 and 51,000 limit, it will significantly support those. And the majority of that 98% of rateable value below 51 as well. So I can't remember the first question, apologies.
The first question was about, would it put you off essentially doing bigger stores and just concentrating on smaller stores? And do you want to just give us a flavour around what that means for your business?
Thank you. We are very much a convenience business, so the average size of our store is about 3,000 square foot. We have, I can think of a couple of stores that are bigger, that are very much legacy stores from many years ago. In general, our approach is to open small stores, convenience stores. So the question about how it would affect us, our decisions to open bigger stores, doesn't really apply to us because we are very much a small store operator.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming today. The co-op is a vital element of many of the communities in my area of New Nabbit in South Devon. It's a mainstay of many communities. I'm interested in the bill where we have the jump between the small business rates and the larger business rates based on the rateable value of 51,000. Is that an issue for you in terms of deterring expansion and improvement of the stores, or is that not something that you worry about?
It's, as I think it's an earlier question, it's one of the factors that we'll bear in mind. I don't think it would necessarily be the deciding factor to either open or indeed keep open a store. There'll be other things like crime, like a changing demographic and footfall. There's a number of factors we will take into account. I think it is a factor. I'm not sure it is the determining factor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Mr. Gerrard. Thank you for coming today. I'm a Labour and Cooperative MP, so I'm really pleased to hear that you think it will be a good thing for the cooperative group. I suppose my questions were partly around the multiplier. Do you, the limit? Do you think it's set at that? You say it will probably help you overall. Do you think it's set at the right limit then? Not only for it's hard for you to maybe answer this, but for you, but as for retail as a group, I suppose. And my other question would be, you were saying it may have positive effects for your smaller stores in that you may be able to employ more people, that kind of thing. So I wondered if you could expand on that, because the cooperatives in Falmouth and Truro, where I am, are having issues at the moment with maybe theft and violence against shop workers, which are not good, and the bid is providing support, but I wondered whether having that leeway to maybe employ more people or even security people, would that be something you would be enabled to do you think?
So I'll start at the beginning, and hopefully I'll cover all questions. This is good for the co-op group as a whole. There's ups and downs, because as I said, 8% of our estate wouldn't benefit from this, and indeed it may cost us. But overall, I think it's a good thing. I also think, as well as being a director of the co-op group, I'm a board member at Cooperatives UK, which is the apex body, and this is good for the cooperative movement. So I think that's the first point. I think. At present, the rate system doesn't incentivise either improvement or growth. One of the things I think the rate system needs to do is, and there's a link here, so for example, if we put in CCTV to keep our colleagues safe, our rate bill goes up. If we put in air conditioning, not just for food safety, but to reduce the amount of refrigeration we need, because the ambient temperature's down, our rate bill goes up. It seems to me that the rates bill should incentivise growth. And I think the structure does, and I think the two rates built of under 500 and 151k do incentivise investment and growth. So that would mean more shops for us and employing more people. But I'm not sure some of the way the reliefs and work does that. The improvements relief, as I understand it, only is to do with the shell of the shop. So if you put in a CCTV, or perhaps if you put in a coffee machine, or they will result in an increase in the rate. So I think something about whether the system as a whole incentivises. I think this structure definitely does. I think there's some detail on crime. The co-op's been very, very loud on this. I've been to this place a number of times to give evidence about crime. I think what I would say is the rates structure, the rate proposal we very much welcome. It's self-evident to say that the changes the Chancellor made on NICs will cost us money, but we understand the choices that they made. I think what's got lost a little bit is that what the government announced on crime, which is a £5 million investment on Pegasus, as well as 13,000 officers, as well as a standalone offence, that will impact us. Now, crime costs us £120 million a year. It costs the sector £3 billion a year. If we can make any kind of dent against that, that will again give us that leeway that you talked about. So I think seeing these things in the round is important. For crime, it is about colleagues, it is about security. We've doubled the amount of money we spend on security. It's actually principally about the way businesses and the police work. And if the businesses and the police work well, then I think you can begin to tackle crime. I think the work that Chief Constable Amanda Blakeman at North Wales has done on behalf of all the police forces has been really important in the last year, and we're beginning to see a much improved police response.
Michelle Welch.
Thank you. I should probably confess that one of my first jobs ever was working at a co-op store. I don't know if that's a register of interest or not. But in my constituency of Sherwood Forest, we've actually seen in the past actually the huge impact it has when a local store closes, whatever that store is, when that closes, especially on the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable. And one of the things that I'm been really, really concerned about over the years is accessibility to not only healthy food, but for children to be able to access food. And when you have a young baby, your ability to be able to walk to your local shop. And in fact, for many of my communities in Sherwood Forest, this is not about having your food delivered. It is being able to access it on a local level, on a frequent level, because you are having to manage your money on a daily basis
not on a monthly basis. So buying one meal at a time, for example. And I actually think the co-op plays a real vital role in that and has done over the years. So what I wanted to ask, as we have seen the demise of many of these things over the years, not the co-op, but just in general, that store in the middle of the community that knows the local people. I know that when I worked at my local store, you knew that if someone didn't turn up for their Sunday paper, there was an issue and there was a problem. That kind of community feeling that actually crosses all departments of the government, actually. Let's not health, well-being, absolutely everything. So what I wanted to ask is, do you think that this bill will help to ensure your local stores actually become more accessible to people, that you maintain that connectivity with your community, and actually what it actually becomes is working with the government with all of those other areas when we're talking about combating poverty, and child health? Thank you.
The short answer is yes, because I think fundamentally this bill will ease the burden of rates on small retail, hospitality and leisure. That's the bottom line. If it's below 51k, which, you know, if I look at our estate, 2/3 of our estate are below 51k, they are the kind of shops you've just described. It will significantly reduce the burden on those shops and also those between 51 and 500. So I think it will. I think we saw, I've seen in a number of different things we've done, the loneliness campaign that we ran, but also retail crime, that shops in general can be real, as I said before, anchor institutions for communities. I don't think we always recognise that in policy terms. I think this does, because by definition it's saying it's a good thing. I think government can think more about the kinds of things that all kind of retail can do, not just economically and in terms of jobs, but in terms of the impact they can have in communities. So I think this does recognise that as a policy principle, and I think it can be a first step to perhaps thinking more about the way shops support and function in communities.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify. A number of members have mentioned their relationship to the Co-op Party. Can you tell us, does the Co-op group still fund the Cooperative Party? Is there still a relationship between the two? And then, in respect of your evidence, you talked about the kind of overall impact. Is it still? Okay. Yeah.
To explain the relationship.
The second question, hopefully.
Well, you've got 2 minutes.
Okay. You mentioned the overall impact of this alongside national insurance and other things which you were analysing, and said that was obviously going to be a significant consideration in terms of your view about the impact of this particular legislation. What is your view about that overall impact? And in particular, you mentioned some of the uncertainties. You said you felt overall it would be beneficial to your business, but there were uncertainties. How do you see clarity being brought to that overall impact so that you know what its impact will be then on jobs, premises and so on, and your investment plans?
So we looked at the budget and indeed other measures in the round. As I said before, you know, it's not a insightful thing to say that the next changes on employers will impact us. It will cost a significant amount of money. Absolutely will. On top of that, we've got the real living wage. I said before, we pay living wage foundation, real living wage, and that's probably cost us £120 million. 160 million pounds over the last three or 4 years. So there are headwinds coming towards us. But if you look at in the round, I think, on top of that, I would not underestimate the impact tackling retail crime can have. £3 billion for the retail sector, £120 million for the co-op. If you can make a 10-20% impact in that, it's significant. I think the rates proposal, as I've said, you know, and the reason here, I think this is good for the vast majority of retail. I think so. If you look at in the round, I think we're beginning to see what headwinds and supporting winds that we will have to face. That's becoming clearer, and that allows us to plan. And we've got plans to grow our business, and we think that, you know, it's a challenging environment. Retail always is, but we think in the round we begin to get that certainty, and certainly the rates proposals for a business like the Co-op, national business of small shops, is a really supportive proposal.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for the committee to ask questions. I thank Mr. Gerrard on behalf of the committee for his evidence. We will now hear all evidence from Edward Woodall, Government Relations Director at the Association of Convenience Stores. For this session, we have until 10:40. Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Vickers. Welcome, Mr. Woodall. Thank you for your willingness to give evidence. May I ask, could you set out your view of the overall impact, both financial and administrative, on your members that this will bring in? And perhaps in addition, a more specific question, could you give us a sense of how many of your member stores will share premises or will host other things like post offices or banking hubs?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence. Ed Woodall from the Association of Convenience Stores. We represent the UK's 50,000 convenience retailers. Those retailers trade from premises that are under 280 square metres, so very small premises. To give you a sense of scale, the largest retailer would be, that size of store would be a sort of double tennis court. That's the absolute biggest. So they're very small format stores, and most are smaller than that. So in the context of the bill, this is very helpful because most of those will benefit from the lower retail hospitality and rate relief multiplier as a result. So there's 71% of our sector that are independent retailers, but a large majority will be benefiting from that lower 51,000 rateable value threshold overall. So in that sense, it is very positive for the sector, but it's also very positive for the places that they trade as well. So we talk a lot in terms of high streets as the shorthand term, but actually most of our members are trading from secondary shopping parades. So about 70% or so are in those secondary areas servicing sort of neighbourhood parade. Think five, a small block of sort of 5 shops in those types of locations. So actually we're supporting the provision of services very locally, close to where people live and work. So in that sense, it's very beneficial. And I think it'll also hopefully help give some more certainty and permanency to the support to the sector in the long run in terms of certainty around investments that they can make in the future. And I'm trying to sort of give some examples. If you take a convenience retailer that's just outside of the small relief threshold, so say 15,000, 16,000 rateable value, the multiplier set at 5 pence lower, you'd be saving something like £1,000 a year as a business. If it's set at 20p, so the full extent of the flexibility, you'd be saving something like £3,000 a year. So actually they're quite reasonable sums for them to consider investing elsewhere, whether that might be in new software to help them manage shifts or in new CCTV systems to help them address the issue of crime. So overall, very positive. In terms of the questions around post offices, there's I think 11,500 post offices in the UK, and about 8,000 of those are hosted within convenience stores in a sort of post office local format, as well as lots of other services like parcel collection, bill payments and those types of things. So service provision, which is very high volume, quite low margin, is a big part of the convenience store business. Sustaining them is challenging with the existing environment, so it's important that we get those support targeted in that way.
May I ask just specifically around small business rate relief, what your view is on that particular point?
Small business rate relief is incredibly important for our membership. It helps the very smallest businesses to get the relief. It also has some very sort of specific features. It's automatically applied. There's some tapers between 12,000 rateable value and 15,000 rateable value, and it is really supporting the very smallest businesses within our sector. And I think they will be trading in rural locations, often serving isolated communities. So we're very keen that with any change in business rates legislation, that we get some reassurances that there's a strong commitment to retaining small business rate relief, because as much as the multipliers are very helpful to businesses that are sort of slightly the larger end of our membership, it's that small bit that are really important that we protect, and the small business rate relief is a sort of great mechanism to do that. We've got lots of suggestions of how we might improve small business rate relief in the future to make it work better for more retailers. I think with the upcoming revaluation, we're likely to see higher retail prices, and as a result, the sort of thresholds need to index up with that higher cost. Otherwise, businesses are going to start to slip out of the small business rate relief support as well. So certainly, as much as we welcome this bill, we'd like to hear more about what we can do to improve small business rate relief to help the very smallest businesses in isolated locations.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Thank you for giving time to give evidence today. The way that you explain the nature of your members and their businesses are very much the anchors of a community. They are the place that provides, of course, the food, but also in many places access to finance in terms of post office facilities, postal services, etc. How many of your members do you assess will benefit from the measures being taken here, given it's such a targeted relief at those retail, hospitality and leisure businesses of this type of scale that you talk about?
So very much the majority of the membership. So the breakdown of the membership is about 71% are independently operated across the convenience sector. And then the other third are operated by multiple retailers. So there might be a cooperative, or there might be a Sainsbury's Local or a Tesco Express. Now, lots of those premises will sit underneath the large majority of those will sit under the £51,000 rateable value, or still be in with that the standard multiplier, which of course for retail, hospitality and leisure, as I understand, will be lower as well. So I think overall, the most convenience retailers, as small format retailers trading from spaces under 280 square metres and secondary locations, will benefit from the lower multipliers.
And just on the point you made about how potentially to improve the system more generally, we clearly want this to be a measure that supports the fabric of community. You know, in the end, these are retail businesses, but they are the places often that bind communities together. And that's very much the way that we as a government perceive them and see the value of our high streets, our precincts and our villages and towns. From your perspective, what measures could be taken to really kind of target this down to make sure that support is given where it's needed?
So in terms of the multipliers, I suppose we have to see the rate of the multipliers is what's going to see about the impact overall. And I gave some examples around where you set the multipliers will determine how much businesses can invest. But in the sense of what's described in the bill, it is well targeted for retail, hospitality and leisure to support the areas that my members trade in and the types of businesses that the community want in those locations as well. So if we look at our polling about the most desired services on local parades, convenience stores, post offices and pharmacies come top, and all of those trade out of similar premises. So hopefully it will help our sector, but it will also help the other businesses that trade in those locations as well to continue to deliver those services too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for coming in and giving evidence. Can I ask a question about the timing of this? We know that the retail, hospitality and leisure relief is going to be reducing to 40% in April, but this isn't coming in until the April afterwards. Do you have any concerns about the convenience store area in terms of the impact that will have in that year until we know what's happening the following year?
Yeah, I think if you're talking to convenience retailers now about business rates, what's front of mind for them is that the reduction in the retail, hospitality and leisure relief has gone down from 75% to 40%. And that for April next year is a big hit amongst a sort of cumulative burden of other measures that have been announced in the budget. So that is concerning for them. They talk to us a lot about that as part of the overall budget package as being a challenge. And it was a big challenge. It was a sort of £666 million cost to the sector. That said, we knew that the retail, hospitality, leisure relief was a measure that was introduced in COVID as temporary, so we welcome the fact that it hasn't disappeared completely, it's been tapered. But we also welcome the principle that's set out in this bill that actually we're giving a bit more permanency to the support of retail, hospitality and leisure businesses on the high street in the future. Because there is a sort of cycle of changes in the policy over time, and hopefully this will give us a bit more of a stable footing to understand that. And that doesn't just help us, it helps other businesses think about investing in those locations too, from the retail industry, but also hospitality and leisure too.
Thanks.
Spencer.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Woodall. I was struck by what you were saying regarding rural convenience stores and the importance of supporting them. I couldn't agree with you more. I represent a rural constituency, and in the next door village there is a shop that's been there for years, and I'm terrified every year that it's going to go under, and yet it is very resilient. Do you think this bill should make provisions for convenience stores that stand alone within rural areas, within villages, where they are the only shop left that sells milk, eggs and the newspaper? Do you think it's not just about small and micro businesses, but it's actually about those that are the only ones left? Do you think there should be a provision in this bill for those?
I certainly think there should be provision of support for rural businesses, particularly when they are the last ones serving that community, because they are delivering those essential services to the communities, and there's cost to that community, so you have to travel elsewhere. Whether it is possible to do that through the legislation, I think is an interesting question, and actually it was picked up in some of the previous evidence I think you've heard this morning. But there are measures within local authorities' existing powers to issue discretionary relief for support for those locations. Previously called rural rate relief, but that's been taken over by small business rate relief. But I think the challenge is, do the local authorities have the funding to be able to administer that relief? So I think it's quite challenging to do it in the bill, because you get into a space where you start adding more complexity, and you start identifying regions or locations in national legislation, and actually what we often see is there's more differences within a region than there is between regions. So I agree with the principle of what you're saying. I'm thinking perhaps that the existing powers of local authorities to do that is better, but what that probably needs is support from the government and trust from the government to allow them to administer that well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Woodall, for coming in this morning. We really do appreciate your time. I'm very pleased to hear that your overall assessment is that for the convenience stores that you represent, this bill is going to be a positive thing, and it's going to benefit the vast majority of those. In terms of the savings made, the sort of tangible effect of this bill, what's that going to mean for a shopkeeper in Erewash, where I represent, in terms of things like security, implementation, staffing, operations, etc.?
Sure. I tried to give some examples earlier of how businesses might invest. I suppose the first question is, where are the multipliers set? And obviously I'd encourage the government to use the flexibility to enable the best possible investment that we can. But I think, as the example I identified, that if you have the multipliers set at a lower rate and the business is starting to save thousands of pounds, that is an opportunity for them to think, right, I can update the CCTV system. I might be able to add in some new security measures in store. So it can facilitate that investment. I should also say that with the overall pressures on retailers at the moment, the cumulative burden is very big. They also might have to just use that money to keep operating and be able to keep managing the costs that go up as well. So this bill can facilitate investment, but the government has to think about the overall investment environment for retailers, not just through the rates bill by itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Woodall. I understand that James Lohman, the Chief Executive of the Association of Convenience Stores, has written to the Chancellor sort of following the budget, describing how for smaller convenience stores 2025 is going to be a bleak year, and saying that there's over £666 million of additional cost onto convenience stores because of the budget. Reflecting on what this bill does in terms of multipliers domestic rates, does that make a dent in that, or sort of are your convenience stores going to be sort of a net beneficiaries or net a disadvantage after the budget, and how does these two things fit together?
So you're right, our estimation of the cost of the budget was £666 million. We wrote to the Treasury to set that out. In terms of the bill, as I said, I think what it does provide is a more structure and permanency around the support for retail, hospitality and leisure relief. I can't comment on how much it will do, because I don't know where the multipliers are set yet, but I think that there is an opportunity to be able to make the investment environment for businesses better as a result of this bill, because we're not just looking at one single relief, we're looking at it over a period of time, and the opportunity to have a discussion around how that multiplier is set. One way that the bill could facilitate that better is certainly, I think, in the bill documents there's a sort of a negative resolution for the setting of the lower multiplier. That might want to move to an affirmative resolution, so we can have a debate whether that wants to go up or down in the future, so we can have a closer discussion around those things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr Woodall. Just to follow on from my colleague, honourable friend Adam's question regarding security, a couple of things, please. Could you confirm the estimate benefit to small stores with the proposed business rate relief? And also, I recently, in my constituency, which is Wolverhampton North East, I accompanied my local neighbourhood police team, and we went to several stores on estates, as well as High Street, as well as a retail park as well. And one of the things that the stores had said directly to myself and the local neighbourhood police teams was the shocking increase in retail crime, theft and violence, and with the link with stores directly employing less security staff. So I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts on the impact and the benefits that the savings could make in that terms.
I'll allow you to please comment, Mr Woodall, because that's actually out of scope of the bill, but...
Yes, so I think what I was demonstrating earlier is depending where you put the multipliers depends on how much businesses have to invest as a result. So if you're at a store, you're just outside the small business rate relief, if you put the multiplier down by 5 pence, you could save £1,000. If you put the multiplier down by 20 pence, you could save somewhere just over £3,000. So there's options there about the different things you can invest in. So the lower we're able to put that multiplier, the more opportunity there's to invest. I think one of the investment areas, and of the £1 billion that our sector invested last year, it is in defensive investment around CCTV to make sure stores and colleagues are safe. So hopefully this might help this in the future as well.
Final question, Lewis Cocking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. You said into the answers to your first question, we could approximately see businesses save about 1,000 or 3,000, depending on their size. And then you go on to say, well, they could use that money to make investments within their business and what have you. Well, the businesses I speak to in Broxbourne say that they're going to have to put that money aside for other measures in the budget. And you sort of allude to in your answer, businesses are very worried about the other measures in the budget. So how do those two marry up? Obviously, they can't be investing in their business with these savings and putting money aside for the other measures within the budget. So what proportion of your members are saying which one of those things?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. So some of them might take it and invest in the additional services provision or the things that I've described in the bill. Others might have to just say, look, the cumulative impact of the costs that we're facing is big. We have to use that money in the space to continue to trade. And actually you see that more starkly when you look at small business rate relief. How do retailers use small business rate relief? About a quarter of them say, well, we're using that to be able to stay trading because of how the changing operating environment as well. So different businesses will make different operational decisions around how they use the money. Some will try and address that cumulative burden, others will invest in other locations. I don't have a figure for the entire sector around how they will allocate that.
Could I just follow up?
2 minutes.
Are you going to ask your members that question?
We talk to them all the time about those questions, and perhaps there's something we can address in our written evidence to the committee. Mark
Seaward, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. We've heard a lot about the costs of the measures in the budget, including in this bill. Would you accept that there is some positive benefit towards providing certainty to businesses, certainty that's been missing for a little while? Obviously, the measures in this bill are designed to provide certainty over a longer period of time, but the measures in the rest of the budget are also designed to provide that too.
Well, in terms of this bill, I think I've said on a number of occasions that we welcome the fact that it brings more structure, and the overall principle is about long-term support for retail, hospitality, leisure businesses and the areas that they trade. So in terms of that principle, we very much welcome it, and I think overall businesses welcome greater certainty around how they can invest into the future. So I very much welcome that in the context of the bill.
Okay, thank you.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allotted for this witness. I thank Mr Woodall for giving his evidence. We now come to all evidence from the British Retail Consortium, and for this session we have until 11 o'clock. Very good. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Could the witnesses introduce themselves, please?
Hello everybody, my name's Helen Dickinson. I am the Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium. We are the trade body for the retail industry. Our members cover all sorts of retailers who sell both online and through shops right across every category. We have about 200 members, and we also have various trade associations who represent independent retailers within our membership. So we're the lead body for the retail industry.
Good morning everyone, I'm Tom Ironside, I'm Director of Business and Regulation at the BRC. My team has responsibility for property policy, including business rates.
Good. Welcome to our witnesses. Shadow Minister.
Mr Vickers, thank you, and welcome to both of you. Thanks for your time today. I know your organisation has been quite vocal about the need for this legislation to introduce a retail rates corrector as a means of addressing some of the imbalances. I wonder if you could perhaps share with the committee your views about whether anything in the bill helps to address those particular concerns, which I know are long-standing ones in the retail sector. And then perhaps if you could develop that in the context of the budget, which we've heard a lot of evidence about. This is one of those things which businesses are looking at the overall impact of. Could you tell us your members' views about the overall impact that the budget has had, and give us a steer as to what that suggests we should be doing in this bill?
Slightly out of scope of the bill, if the witnesses could comment on that within the context of the bill.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'll kick off. I've been doing this job for 12 years, I think, and business rates has always been a big issue for retailers of all shapes and sizes, and there's been many attempts over many decades to look at how the system could be reformed. And so that recognition that the business rate system as it currently stands disincentivises investment in communities up and down the country is very, very welcome. So the starting point is a great recognition that there is need to reform this system. And it's also great to see the importance of retail and hospitality and leisure businesses in that context, and really thinking differently about the business rate system and how it applies to those businesses, because for many other industries, business rates is a sort of tiny proportion of their cost base, whereas for retail and for hospitality, it is a much more significant part of their costs. I think our headline is that in the context of welcoming that and all the potential that it has to really stimulate local investment, I think it doesn't necessarily go quite far enough to be able to really deliver the scale of investment and far-reaching change that we need to see up and down the country. And the reason for that is to do with this 500,000 upper level for the higher threshold. So there are about 4,000 shops that sit currently above that 4,000 at that £500,000 rateable value threshold. Many of those shops sit on high streets up and down the country. Many of them are what in retail might call anchor stores. They drive footfall that is part of the ecosystem that where sort of larger businesses, smaller businesses all sort of coexist, and that is what makes successful high streets. We also, there are, from a retail point of view, there are, because those 4,000 shops potentially are captured by this higher threshold, in the way that many businesses think about investment, they are looking at what their customers are wanting in local communities, and whether that is an out-of-town shop or a shop in a high street. If you are actually penalising some shops in order to support other shops and hospitality businesses, then the ability for that ecosystem of investment that we really want to drive to reinvigorate high streets is being held back. Now, we've looked, because I think that's a big question because of the way that whole bill is set up. It's like, well, does that work in the context of are there enough other properties that aren't retail and hospitality to be able to still achieve the parameters of the bill and the sort of self-funding mechanism that it creates? And there are about 12,000 other properties that aren't retail or hospitality or leisure businesses that sit above that £500,000 threshold. And so there is, for those businesses, that business rates change if there is a higher multiplier is a tiny proportion. So I think our modelling suggests about 0.2% of their profits. So actually, for all of the other companies right across the economy, this is a much smaller issue than it is within the retail and the hospitality industry for that matter. And so we think that actually the way that either through the bill or, as I understand it, it doesn't necessarily have to be done through the bill, that government can actually make that decision outside the bill, but either in the bill or some sort of assurance from government that they're going to look at it. We need to really think about how those over £500,000 properties should be taken out of the upper level funding elsewhere, and that ability to support retail and hospitality businesses in their totality is the way that it should be thought about. And that, I suppose, just touching on the bit that may be out of scope, comes in the context of the significant cost changes that the budget and particularly the national insurance changes represented. And again, just to put some numbers out there, so we looked at what the cost to retail of the national insurance change is, about 2.3 billion. Across retail and hospitality, we're talking about a potential benefit of about 1.3 if you include all of retail within the scope of the bill. So we're not even so it's a lower amount, I suppose, than just the national insurance change. And that's another reason why we think it's really important that we include all shops in the context of that nobody ends up paying more, that the smaller shops end up paying less, and you just take those larger shops out of the uplift as the way to really drive that investment in local communities.
Brief supplementary.
Mr. Dickinson, we have heard some evidence around appeals in respect of the decisions that will arise from this. Now, clearly there is a degree of uncertainty, and we don't yet know what the multipliers are. Businesses can't plan for that. Do you have a view about whether the current system is fit for purpose in order to address what may arise? And if not, what measures you'd like to see to make it work better?
Tom, take it.
Yeah, I can take that one. So in terms of the existing system and its fitness or its ability to actually handle what may arise, I think there are long-standing concerns about the ability of the appeal system to respond effectively, long backlogs, people reporting that they exit one revaluation not having resolved issues from the previous ones. So there are real long-standing issues which need to be tackled. Inevitably, if you look at the approach that's being taken with the introduction of a new threshold, as you look at that, that will create additional tension for companies that sit just above that threshold, and that is likely to increase the number of appeals, and it also may have an impact on investment decisions as you get close to the threshold, because there's a marginal tax rate impact which could be very significant if you move from being in receipt of a discount for retail property through to seeing an upward multiplier under the existing proposal.
Thank you for attending the evidence session, and also thank you for the written evidence that you provided by way of preparation for the meeting. I think there is an acceptance in the evidence that you have given that any system that you design in the business rate system ends up having to draw the line somewhere. It's the nature of the multipliers, it's the nature of the value that you apply. But it stands as fact that for most of your members, of the 4,000 you say will be above the £500,000 threshold, there are 772,000 that are below the threshold. So it stands the case that the vast majority of your members will be the beneficiaries of the measures taken here. And although it can be portrayed, and it has been portrayed during the evidence session here, that the relief is being decreased from 70 to 40. The truth is that the temporary relief over COVID was due to come to an end. It was a cliff edge.
Yeah.
And what this does is to provide a permanent relief in legislation that gives that certainty over the long term. And it'd be interesting to know the views of your members on that.
I think I was just hearing the end of the previous session, and there are obviously we've got to get to the point of implementation, but I think once we are there, that long-term certainty is going to be really important, and I can completely understand the context in which the COVID support was given and how valuable that was. So I think, while painful as it may be for many businesses in transitioning from a higher discount to whatever this new system might be, longer term certainty outweighs that, because we won't then be sort of limping from year to year, sort of waiting to see what that might look like. In the context of your other point about the proportion of businesses and shops that would benefit from the proposals as they currently stand, I completely agree that the proportion that when I mentioned the 4,000 shops earlier, that is less than 5% of the total number of shops. Where I think it becomes much more difficult is if you look at that small proportion of shops, that is about a third of the rateable value of all shops. So if you think about it within a retail context, what we're effectively doing is penalising some shops to support other shops, and that from a sort of competitive landscape within retail, where businesses are, from a consumer point of view, day in, day out, competing for business, actually is distortive to competition, and that's why we don't think, we agree completely that you've got to draw a line somewhere. We think the line should sit outside of retail and hospitality rather than be drawn within retail and brackets, I'm sure, hospitality, she says, with her retail hat on, but we're talking retail and hospitality here. Does that answer your question?
It does a bit, but I'm not entirely sure it hits at the facts, to be blunt about it, which is it's not the case from the evidence that properties above £500,000 are essentially cross-subsidising those below £500,000, because those above £500,000 are only 7.5% of the total rateable value in the whole system. So it's not the case that is the transfer that we're seeing. Is it not also the case that many of your members who will be occupying premises above the £500,000 will be the larger footprint occupiers, like supermarkets, like big department stores? And if we were to move essentially the cross-subsidy entirely over to warehousing and distribution, they would only pay it on the back end anyway, because Tesco and Sainsbury's and the rest have huge warehousing and distribution models in their business, and they pay on the back end anyway.
I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of answer that question without sort of going into too many detail in numbers. So the cross-subsidy, again, I agree, it isn't a full, we're not talking about one to the other within retail. So if you look within retail, the rateable value of all of the sort of small and medium-sized retail properties is about 9.2 billion, and 4.6, and then there's additional 4.6 that is the larger property. So take that together, that's about 13.8, of 1/3 large, 2/3 small. But there are, as you say, there are many other properties that sit outside retail that include warehouses, distribution centres, but also include offices. And in fact, I think the biggest chunk is actually offices. And so so we're not just talking about sort of things that will impact retail, like warehouses coming in to the other side of the equation. We're talking about all those other sectors as well. And I think, going back to what I said at the beginning, the really I think if the real objective of this is to stimulate local investment in communities, and that is got to be the goal, because we all want to see our high streets and our town centres, flourishing and vibrant with a diversity of offer, which is what consumers, we all as customers, are looking for. Then we've got to be able to find a way that where that funding comes from, whether it is right across the spectrum of all sorts of properties, offices, whether it's distribution centres, whatever else sits outside. And the modelling that we've done shows that is really possible within the context of the framework that you've laid out.
And just to come in there and to be clear, we're talking about the exemption of shops above £500,000. We're not talking about the exemption of other sorts of properties. So just as a point of clarity.
But for clarity for the record, the 7.5% of total rateable value was just for retail, hospitality and leisure of the overall business rate tax take in its entirety. It doesn't take into account offices or warehouses. I just think it was important that we set the context correctly in framing the conversation.
We can provide you with clarity on the figures, which we can lay out in a subsequent note if that's helpful.
It would be very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked a lot about the retail properties over 500,000, but there is also that cliff edge at 51,000. And there's a lot of businesses, I know one fantastic things in Bournemouth, which is a brilliant treasure trove of lots of micro businesses who would otherwise not have the ability to be on the high street. Have you got any comment about whether that 51,000 is A, set at the right level, or B, should exist at all?
I'll start and then I'll hand over. Tom highlighted earlier that whenever you have a threshold of some description, then there's going to be, that cliff edge risk. I think it is, and I know that it's a goal of the current government, and it was of the previous government, to really ensure that small and micro businesses get the support that they need to be able to grow. So I think there is recognition right across retail that what happens below there's a case, shall we say, for a higher discount for really small businesses as they begin to grow, and a next level discount, for want of a better description, for those above. And I think the threshold risk, obviously it is there, but improvements that are also part of the proposals that were in the discussion paper that aren't necessarily in the bill, but are all these other things about transparency of data by the VOA, the processes that the VOA actually go through, should at least give a greater ability to get through those appeals process and give people more clarity and certainty, which hopefully will avoid some at least of the consequences of those thresholds. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying there's recognition that there needs to be a greater discount for really small micro businesses, and then you've got to set a level at some point, and whether 51 is exactly the right number. I think whether it's 51 or 500, it's important that it sort of indexes with inflation, because otherwise it will get eroded over time. And whether that is something that needs to be in the scope of the bill, I think is sort of part of the way to address your question. But I don't know if that helps. Do you want to add anything?
I think just on that final point, in 2001 there was around £40 billion worth of rateable value on the list. Now we've got £70 billion worth of rateable value on the list. It's inevitable if you don't have some sort of operating mechanism in relation to, we've identified the £500 threshold, but I suspect you can make an equal case for the £51,000 one. If you don't have that operating, you erode the benefit and the purpose of what's being set out here. So we feel quite strongly on that front.
Thank you.
1 minute left, and 2 members have indicated, but Jane Kirkham.
Very quick then. It was just very quickly what you were saying about that higher limits and shops and supermarkets, basically, it would be, wouldn't it? Because they'd be big.
Not just supermarkets, so just larger shops.
Okay, because I was going to kind of bring in the hospitality and leisure, which is probably something I will ask later on to those people. But of course, I'm from Cornwall, and we have some big leisure, sites and hospitality as well. So to look at exemptions purely for shops would not...
No, I think there's absolute recognition that it should be if the scope of the goal is about retail, leisure, and hospitality, that should be this. So larger premises.
Then you're looking at a much bigger thing.
The proportion in retail is much bigger than the proportion in leisure.
Yeah.
So we'll share some data with the committee that sort of draws, because we looked at retail and hospitality as well. But so I agree, it should be both.
I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our allotted time. I thank the witnesses for their evidence. Excuse me.
Thank you. Apologies to everyone who's questioned.
We now come to oral evidence from Stuart Adams, Senior Economist at Tax Institute for your Fiscal Studies. And for this session, we have until 11:25. Shadow Minister.
Mr Vickers, thank you. Mr Adam, I know your organisation's had a long-standing interest in the reform of business rates. Could you perhaps start by telling us, given that background, what your perspective is on how far this bill goes to address the concerns that you've had and the calls that you've made for that reform to take place?
Basically doesn't do anything about them. You can argue about the pros and cons of what is in the bill, but it's largely separate from our concerns about it, which the discussion paper raises a couple of potential reforms in the longer term that are more related to it. My view is that there is an issue about, possibly more frequent than 3 yearly revaluations, and particularly trying to shorten the antecedent valuation date, the period from the valuation to when it takes effect from 2 years to 1 year, I think would be good. Actually, my ideal would be to move to a land value tax for commercial property, which doesn't seem to be on the table, but things like reliefs for improvements for a certain period have been introduced, and again, there's something in there about whether that's working well and whether it should be extended and so on. So I do have a set of concerns about business rates. They're not really got much to do with what's in the bill.
Thank you very much. Could you share with us an assessment, your view, essentially about the impact that the measures in the bill will have on the affected sectors?
Sure. Well, so there's two sections of the bill, one about multipliers and one about private schools, and we should probably separate them because they're really very different issues. In terms of the changes in multipliers, I think this gets widely misunderstood, because what gets left out of the equation is essentially the economics and specifically what the consequences will be for rents. Basically, business rates are not what is killing the high street, and changes to business rates aren't what will save it. Broadly speaking, and as a very rough first pass, and we can nuance this quite a lot, but as a very rough first pass, when business rates go up or down, rents tend to go down or up almost pound for pound in the long run, which means that actually business rates don't have a big impact on the cost of premises. That's much more about the supply of property. Now, as I think there are a number of nuances to that. One is, to some extent, business rates does affect the supply of property, and that will feed through into rents and affordability. And so you can think about the effect that this would have on the incentive to build bigger or smaller properties, or properties focused on retail, leisure and hospitality versus other sectors, or the incentives to use properties in one sector versus another, or indeed whether properties are used for commercial purposes or housing and so on. And those things, I think there will be some effect, and that will affect affordability as a knock-on consequence of that. But I think that's clearly longer term and second order, and things like the planning regime are much more important for that kind of thing. If you take the supply of properties as given, then to that extent, changes in business rates get offset by changes in rents. So, for example, the rise in business rates on properties with rates of a value of more than 500,000, I would expect rents to fall by, a similar amount over the long term. And again, the over long term is another caveat here. And therefore, it's a one-off hit to the owners of that land rather than to the occupiers of that property. With reduced multipliers for retail, leisure and hospitality, it's a bit more complicated because, again, it depends on how far there can be shifts of use in properties between different purposes. To the extent that properties used for retail, leisure and hospitality are stuck for that purpose and can't be used for anything else, and vice versa, then the same applies. To the extent that actually, shops can be converted into offices and vice versa and that kind of thing, then it is more complicated, and what you would expect is that overall the reduced multipliers would lead to an increase in rents, but it would lead to a smaller increase in rents for all properties. And so actually retail, leisure and hospitality would become more affordable, but only to the extent that offices and factories and so on become less affordable. So it would still wash out overall in terms of rents, and the beneficiaries would still be the landlords rather than the businesses occupying them and using them. But there can still be a shift between retail, leisure and hospitality and other sectors of the economy.
Thank you, Mr. Adam, and thank you for coming to give evidence today. I take absolutely what he said, and you're far more qualified on these matters than I am, so I'm not even going to try to test some of it. I can say, though, from my experience in Oldham, what businesses are really asking for is for respite, that they found it very difficult. It's true that COVID has been and gone, but the operating environment before COVID was very difficult for many high streets and town centres, and in particular, retail, hospitality and leisure. And so there is something in there, isn't there, that in some places, particularly where the economy is vibrant and there's high levels of demand for premises, there may well be a shift from business rates to rent as you move the system round. But actually in most places, where there isn't that high level of demand and you have lots of empty vacant units, this is about making the activity more affordable so it can operate and keep its head above water. And actually there probably won't be that type of shift that he talks about.
I disagree. I think there still would be over the longer term. And again, these things do take time as rental contracts adjust, as new tenants are found for premises, and so on. But the theory is reasonably clear, and the evidence, such as we've got, which is fairly thin, basically supports the theory pretty much completely. Again, I would emphasise that the short run is different. You would absolutely expect there to be respite for retail, hospitality and leisure sectors at the moment until there is time for rents to adjust. Again, one thing to bear in mind is that we have had actually more generous reliefs for retail, hospitality and leisure in recent years, and to the extent that some rents have been renegotiated during that period, it's also possible that if people, firms, the market was actually expecting reliefs more like 75% to continue, it may actually be that rents have gone up, and actually the fact that this relief is less generous than the things it's replacing means that in the short run actually they'll be worse off than if these reliefs had never been introduced, although obviously still better off than if the relief was got rid of completely. But over time, my expectation would still be that it will get reflected in rents.
I accept that to a point, but the temporary relief the previous government brought in to cover the impact of COVID on the high street and retail, hospitality and leisure was at a point in time where those businesses were absolutely decimated, when the economy changed beyond all recognition in a way that none of us had experienced before. That isn't the world today, but it is still a very difficult operating environment. has he made an assessment of the impact of the previous temporary relief coming to an end in the way that it was a cliff edge? I mean, it was literally going to stop. There was no provision for it to continue in any form in the budget or the OBR forecast, and I'm guessing from the IFS either. What impact would that have had on the high street?
Yeah, so the short answer is I'm not aware, I mean, we haven't, and I'm not aware of any good empirical study of what that was likely to do. And it is slightly interesting and strange the way it evolved, because, of course, and it was introduced as as a relief in desperate times during COVID, but as COVID was coming to an end, it was made more generous rather than less, moved up from 50 to 75%, if I remember rightly, at that point. And again, I'm absolutely not disputing in any way that it did provide and does provide much needed respite, particularly at times of crisis. But as a long-term permanent thing, I don't think the effects are the same. I'd also say, by the way, that one thing I completely welcome is whatever you want to do with this, setting it up as a clear long-term part of the system rather than having year-to-year uncertainty as to what the number's going to be, whether it's going to continue and so on. Whatever decision you're going to make, making it a permanent part of the system is a very good thing.
Thank you. Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Adam, in Northern Ireland, there is a single regional rate and then a local levy. I wonder whether you've got any views about whether there should be any local influence in terms of these determinants, reflecting higher rents in some particularly sort of southeast, southwest areas that makes lots of businesses higher in the 51,000 threshold.
Well, I think there are a number of questions there. One is how far the rates should be set locally versus centrally. And obviously there was a history there of them being centralised in 1990. And I think, there is a question as to how much localism you want. If you are going to have local taxes, property taxes are a pretty good choice. I think housing more so than business property taxes, but if you wanted to localise more taxes, I think business rates wouldn't be a bad choice, and there may be things you can do along the lines that we've seen already about, for example, having a ballot of local businesses as a requirement and that kind of thing. I think there is a case for whether it should be local or central. I don't have a strong view either way on that. There is a question as to how far the revenues should be redistributed across the country and whether areas that get more business rates, revenue should have more funding as a result, which again comes into a broader question about the local government finance system. I think it's not obvious that just happening to have more high-value businesses in an area is a good reason for that area to get more revenue. I think there's a better argument for things like business rate retention, where you want to give local authorities some incentive, some reward for having more businesses, encouraging them and generating local economic growth and so on. And there's then a question about whether, even if it's set centrally, the rates and thresholds of business rates should be different across the country. It's not obvious to me that there's a good argument for that, but then it's not obvious to me that there's a good argument for it being different across different sizes of business or sectors or whatever either. I wouldn't rule out that you could make a case for it, and actually in those other cases, in terms of smaller businesses and for retail, hospitality and leisure, I think actually you can make a case for it. I'm not saying that you should never have any variation, but I think I'd want to hear that argument made clearly, and in terms of variation across areas, I don't think I have heard that argument made.
Thank you.
Jane Kirkham.
Thank you very much. I'm from Cornwall, where we do actually have full business rates retention in Cornwall, so that does add a slightly different spin on it, really. So I wondered maybe you could, considering that varies across the country, whether you could maybe mention that. And just what you were talking about high streets and rents going up or down, I think because also I come from a place where there's lots of seaside towns, there's therefore very limited space by the water, and we're on a lot of our properties are owned by kind of faceless corporations or insurance funds. So the rents aren't remotely responsive, to be honest. They've stayed high for a long time because they see them as an asset on a balance sheet. So we've struggled very much with that. So I think for some places, maybe you would disagree, but that the business rates are actually even more important because the rents don't they either take a very long time to have impact at all, or we're just left with very empty properties for a very long time.
So again, I think I would disagree. I mean, actually, the cases where properties are owned by big faceless corporations, it's possibly even more true. Because clearly they are just going to want to set the highest rent they can get away with, but the amount of rent they can get away with will depend on the demand for that property, and how much demand for the property there is depends on how much business rates comes attached to it alongside the rent that comes attached to it. And so, again, you would expect rents to adjust in the long run. How long the long run is an interesting question. I mean, there's some evidence that it starts to happen in a relatively short period. I mean, say 3-4 years, something like that. The evidence isn't great on it. It's actually, the rent adjustment probably happens quicker than it would have done 20, 30 years ago, because actually commercial rent contracts have become shorter, and also there's more use of things like commercial voluntary arrangements and things like that allow rents to adjust more quickly. But it can take a fair number of years until rents are renegotiated and contracts come to an end and so on. But I would still very much expect it to happen.
Just a supplementary on that point, isn't part of the tension here actually that in one description in the question it was a description of actually a broken market, and in the response from the evidence that's given it was a response to a functioning market? Isn't the real issue here that many institutional investors would sooner have an empty property with a notional rent attached to it, even if it's never achieved, than accept a tenant for a lower rent that has an impact on its balance sheet overall? I mean, that in there is a tension, isn't there?
Yes, I think that's right. I think there is an interesting question as to why so many properties are left empty for so long, when it would seem to be in the landlord's interest to have anyone in there paying them something than no one in there paying them anything. And there are certainly aspects in which the market doesn't function well. But as I say, on the whole, this still looks to me like a market where basically prices get determined by supply and demand, and the evidence such as we got does seem to support that.
Thank you, Chair. Again, just to tease out more of this remarkable kind of relationship between taxes and rent, just to clarify, you're saying that it's a uniform relationship across geographies, across locations, shop types. There's a big difference between Oxford Street and your town high street, and you're saying that there's no variation between the behaviour of rents and taxes in both of those situations?
Broadly speaking, yes. I mean, the rule of thumb that in the long run rent will change almost pound for pound with rates, I think will apply, across different types of properties and different types of location. As I think there is a difference where the tax on the premises isn't fixed, where the tax depends on what the premises is used for example. So, as a relief for particular sectors, I don't think it's just the case as it gets reflected pound for pound, because there is this issue that the use of property may vary.
And have you done any analysis on the impact, the variation of impact between renters and then freehold owners of shops? I know the shops on my high street that own the freehold are the ones that have been there for 15 years. So they haven't weathered the same problems that other shops have. So surely there is an impact on at the margin on those those shops that do own the property.
Yeah. So I guess there are a couple of slightly different things there. The one is you can have a chain of ownership where you have possibly even very short-term sublets and then a let and then a long-term leaseholder and then the ultimate freeholder, and how far and how quickly it gets passed up that chain will again, partly depend on how long-term the contracts are and how easy it is to renegotiate and so on. The second thing is that when I'm talking about what happens as rents adjust, there are businesses, a minority, but a sizable minority, that own their own premises. And so they sort of, in the long run, they may not be affected in their capacity as tenants, but they are still affected in their capacity as landlords to themselves, as it were. And I think one way to think about it is it's basically almost lump sum redistribution across owners of different properties. And so if you own the property and your business rates bill goes down, there is no rent. As it were, you can imagine charging rent to yourself, but reality is you just have a lower bill to pay. Now, I'd say that's kind of a one-off gain in the sense that you could sell that property and you would get more for it in the same way. So you're just better off if your business rates bill has gone down. And if you look at someone else looking to buy it, they would face a lower business rates bill, but they would have to buy it. They would have to pay more to buy the property in the first place. So yes, those businesses that own their own premises would benefit from a business rates cut or lose from a business rates increase if we're talking about those above 500,000 in their capacity as owners, essentially, rather than in their capacity as the business occupying and using the property.
Billington.
Thank you very much, Chair. We have 24% vacancy rate in Ramsgate High Street for many of the reasons that Jane has referred to in relation to Cornwall. So I'm interested to ask you what you think the impact might be of the certainty that this legislation brings to establish long-term help for reviving the high street, particularly when it comes to the impact on rents and also increasing occupancy, because the consequences of long-term drivers that have been undermining the high streets is new behaviours on shopping, not only post-pandemic but also online shopping. So I'm interested to know what you think, if this isn't going to help, what would?
Yeah, so I'll say, first of all, I wouldn't want to say it does nothing to help. It certainly does something in the short run, and I'm also given the quite extreme case of the very purest case in the long run. Even in the long run, it won't be quite as simple as I'm painting it. So there will be some help, but I think it's more second order than first order. I totally agree, as I emphasised earlier, that I think the certainty definitely helps. I also think, there are other parts of the business rate system that we can look at, and the treatment of empty properties, empty property relief, is one, and I think is much more important and much more directly targeted at actually getting properties back into use. I know the government's concerned in the discussion paper mentions issues about basically exploitation of empty property relief by cycling in and out artificially and things like that. I think quite a lot of, I would also emphasise that I think a lot of the struggles of the high street aren't caused by business rates. Things like online competition make a huge difference and aren't driven by that. Is the question?
But to be fair, I'm sorry to interrupt, but online competition is genuinely a problem with business rates, because I know from having previously been a councillor in Hackney, we got more business rates from Amazon having their HQ there than Treasury did from Amazon's existence in the first place. So there is a difference.
But what I'm saying is that if there is a big difference in business rates, but if the business rates isn't changing the overall cost of premises, rent plus business rates, then it's not making much difference to that competition. The fact that people can easily shop online is fundamentally what's driving it, rather than business rates. The fact that high street retailers have to pay rent and rates in a way that online retailers don't, or at least not to anything like the same extent, is absolutely a driver of the difference. But I'm just saying that the business rates component of the cost of premises doesn't actually have that much impact on the overall cost of premises because of this adjustment to rents that happens. As I think there is a broader question as to what can and should be done to protect the high street. That is largely outside my area of expertise, and I know other reviews and studies and things have been done on that. I'm largely going to duck it because it's outside my expertise, but you can clearly... I think there are things that can be done outside tax.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very quick. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Adam. The argument that you put forward today is predicated on this link that you've established between business rates and rent, but a very quick Google Scholar search implies that there's a lot of papers out there that suggest that link is broken somewhat by sluggishness in the rental market. Does that not undermine your argument?
I'd be interested to see which papers on Google Scholar you've seen.
Order. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the time allocated for the committee to ask questions and indeed for this sitting. I thank the witnesses for their evidence. The committee will meet again at 2 p.m. this afternoon here in the Boothroyd room. As it is 11:25, the committee stands adjourned. Order.